and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know about a special episode of Trendlines coming up this Friday. WPR's editor-in-chief, Judah Grunstein, will be talking with Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who's now president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. They'll discuss the recent tensions between China and the West, and where Australia fits in amid the new Cold War that pits Beijing against the U.S. and its allies. Tune in for that on Friday. You won't want to miss it. For today, given that it's back to school week, we thought we would focus on the changing face of schooling in the era of COVID-19. A solid primary and secondary education has traditionally been considered a great equalizer of society, providing children from less privileged backgrounds with the tools they need to achieve greater degrees of financial security and success in their chosen fields. Unfortunately, as we now know, education can serve to entrench socio-economic disparities just as much as it can alleviate them. That is becoming all too clear now as the families and schools with the greatest resources, both financial and technological, look to be the ones best prepared to help children weather the pandemic. But is that destined to be the case? How can schools and teachers, parents, and students level the playing field despite the formidable challenges of COVID-19? I'm happy to be joined on the show today by Rebecca Winthrop to discuss these questions. She's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she's also co-director of the Center for Universal Education. Her work focuses on promoting equality in education, including exploring how education innovations can leapfrog progress, particularly for the most marginalized children and youth. And she advises a number of governments, international institutions, foundations, and other organizations on education issues. Rebecca, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks, Elliot. Happy to be here.
Before we actually start talking about the pandemic, I was hoping you could set the stage for us by discussing the state of education in the world before all of our lives were upended by this new virus. While preparing for this conversation, I came across a report released by UNICEF in 2018 called An Unfair Start, which documented varying degrees of educational inequalities in the preschool, primary, and secondary levels in 40-some rich countries. The picture it presented was not exactly promising. So what were some of the broad trajectories we were seeing in education as a kind of leveler of the social playing field before the pandemic?
It's an excellent question, and one that has a mixed answer, a little bit depending on which country you're born into. But broadly, even before everyone started focusing on education inequality amid COVID, because it's so obvious and in your face, there's huge inequality in the globe in education. And the UNICEF report you talk about is right in their title. It's a sort of unfair start. We've done a lot of research a couple of years ago and revealed something called the 100-year gap, which was basically taking a snapshot of educational attainment around the world and the projected progress, and noting that there's big gaps between kids born in poor communities and kids born in rich communities. And that is between countries and within countries. So, for example, it's going to take 100 years for the poorest girls in sub-Saharan Africa to catch up in educational attainment to the richest boys. Likewise, in the U.S., we're actually a country with huge inequality even before COVID. Just at the very beginning, school readiness indicators, it was estimated the poorest kids in the U.S. would take over 100 years, 126 years to catch up to the richest kids, just on school readiness measures, as they're entering school. So we see these big gaps between poor and rich kids in a lot of countries in the world. There are a few exceptions, some Scandinavian countries that have more equal systems. But that inequality has been a feature in education for a long time.
What are some of the hallmarks of schools that make them more equal? Some of the Scandinavian schools you mentioned, for instance, or I thought one of the interesting things in that UNICEF report was that the level of inequality does not really depend on the level of wealth of a country. There are plenty of less wealthy countries that are doing better on equality than countries like the United States, for instance. So what are some of the characteristics that we see in countries that are doing better on these measures?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it has a lot to do with governance and how systems are structured and financing. And a lot of it is actually, I don't know how to say this, but it's cultural, really. So if you take some of the Scandinavian countries, they invest heavily in public education systems. And they send good teachers to the poorest schools, and parents are not uber involved in booster clubs or raising money for the schools like you see in the US. You wouldn't do that. They sort of distribute money equally where there is need. And in the you brought up the US, so that's a good contrast. In the US, people always say, oh, the US, it doesn't have such a good education system because there's this global test called PISA that the OECD administers, and the US never comes out kind of in the middle of the pack. But the truth is, if you look at schools, the US has some of the top best schools in the entire world. And then it also has some really, 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 really bad schools. And so it's not that everywhere in the US is performing badly. Massachusetts is doing great, if you look at international benchmarks, and other states are doing much worse. And in the US, we have this odd way, which is very dependent on sort of our history and our culture and how our democracy has arisen, of letting communities have really close ownership over their schools. And it's understandable when you think about the connection to school and community and democracy, and perhaps how schools are run and what they're taught, etc. But when it comes to financing, it means you have schools that have wealthy parents raising huge sums of money compared for their individual schools, and giving all sorts of advantages to those kids, versus at the other end of town, parents who don't have that much wealth or time to invest in raising funds for schools don't get that extra support. So there's kind of a built-in individualism and or ability to widen inequality with some of those governance systems.
You mentioned the in-your-face nature of COVID-19 as a promoter of inequality in schools. And as you said, it is very obvious the mechanisms by which that takes place. But to come back to one of the questions I posed in my introduction, is that destiny? Are there some ways that schools and parents and teachers can promote more equality in schools despite the headwinds of COVID-19?
That is a question we are all asking ourselves in the global education community, which is basically, is there a silver lining here? We know that inequality was bad before COVID hit, and with school closures, schools aren't perfect, but they were doing a lot to help equalize. Again, not perfect, but the minute they're stripped away, you really lay the inequality in society quite bare. And you see the huge difference between kids who, live in households that don't have strong sort of family networks or financial resources, completely left out in the cold, compared to kids who have all those things and who are probably doing lots of interesting learning. They're doing self-paced online, taking courses at National Geographic, which happen to be free probably, or they're getting personalized tutors. So it's so extreme amid COVID. It really reminds us that actually, even if they're not perfect, schools served a huge role in society. One, they let parents work, right? Because they are actually, public education systems are in almost every country in the world the largest childcare scheme, national childcare initiative and scheme. Now, of course, that's not all schools do, but the custodial nature is really important. Kids go there. If they're a reasonable school, they're reasonably safe. They can get healthcare. Often they get food and nutrition for those kids who need it. So there's a whole range of social protection and supports that come through schools. And the question is, without that, is there something that's happening as schools are completely scrambling, and I should say with very little notice. I would have to say that teachers and schools are really miracle workers, because it's crazy when you think about it. One day you're, teaching and in school, and then the next day you're supposed to completely pivot to a whole new way of learning through remote learning. It's quite difficult. And are there nuggets of things that could be sustained, that could help us close that inequality gap? We've actually been looking at that. We have a piece coming out this week because of reopening schools, but looking at the medium to long term. The piece is called Beyond Reopening Schools, How Education Can Emerge Stronger Than Before COVID-19. So there's some nuggets in there around tech and parents and various other things. If you'd care for me to elaborate, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, please. What are some of the most promising of these nuggets?
So, it's very early days. Obviously, we're trying to see what are school systems doing, which is what most of the research has been to date. Is like, what is everyone doing? And we've noticed huge inequality. If you take a macro picture, in early days, 90% of high income countries were able to provide some form of online learning, and only 25% of low-income countries were able to provide any type of remote learning, usually TV or radio. So right from the get-go, there's big inequality, and we don't have a ton of evidence of what has been working, but we have seen a couple of things. One is, we are pretty sure that to emerge stronger from COVID, public education has to be at the center. And private actors, private schools, business, the private sector has a role to play in education, but private schools can incubate interesting models. They can, do some innovative practices, but their incentive structure, they don't have the mandate nor the incentive structure to stay operating in an economic crisis, whereas government schools do. So we know we need to lean in on the public schools and public sector. The other thing we've found is that actually low tech, if deployed, especially around something that we call the instructional core, which is the interaction between teachers and students and course material and content, and we have added parents to that. Those interactions are really what helps learning happen. And we've seen some great examples of really low-tech solutions being deployed to help change those interactions in the instructional core, to keep learning going in ways that we think would be really promising to be sustained even after COVID is over.
So I'm assuming these are not things like Zoom lessons when you say low tech.
Yeah, well, what we've seen, one of the most promising things, we're really talking about mobile phones and phone calls and text messages.
Things that don't require a high-speed internet connection, in other words.
High-speed internet, or frankly, a busy parent to stop and switch and get online and log in. So we've seen this these are, we would say, illustrative examples that have made it seem like a promising practice that needs to be looked into more and could potentially be quite helpful over the long term. We've seen low-income parents of first-generation learners, parents who might not have had much education themselves, really engage in brand new ways. And it might be that education systems didn't really know how to engage them in the first place, and COVID gave them the opportunity. But from Baltimore to Botswana to India, we've seen examples where lots of parents who weren't engaged in their kids' learning, or weren't engaged in schools when it was come show up to the PTA meeting or the teacher meeting, and come to the auditorium, and perhaps they were working or they were busy, they couldn't make it, are engaging in their kids, supporting their kids' learning at home, often through sending text messages and teachers sort of nudging and asking parents to help their kids practice something, or on their mobile phone look at a question and do it with them and send it back. I'll give you an example. In India, there's a great organization called Pratham, and they started sending out questions to rural villages, parents in the villages they worked with. They did this for around 12,000 communities, and they would do like a question a day. One would for example, would be, for parents who had young kids who were, learning to read and write and count and stuff, they would say, count how many teeth your mom has and your dad has and your grandma has, and send us back. And so there are kids are counting, the parents are engaged, they're letting their kids use their phone. And there was a lot of that type of thing. It was different for every context. And what we heard from policymakers around the world was, wow, they were totally surprised at how many parents responded and engaged and helped their kids learn. And it's that connection, that sort of school to, sort of family connection, parent to teacher connection that hasn't been very strong before, which we think is quite promising to sustain post-COVID.
And these are kind of questions that can be sent just via text message. So all you need is a mobile phone to participate.
You just need and you can do it by WhatsApp. It's largely by WhatsApp. It depends on each country context, right? Like what parents have. You can do it by WhatsApp because you don't need data for a smartphone, or you can just simple flip phone. You can send it by SMS and then they text back. There's examples in Botswana of a group called Young Love, working with the Ministry of Education in Botswana, who started giving weekly tips to parents on how to practice math, and then they would call the parents and say, please put your phone on the speakerphone and bring your child, and they would spend 15-20 minutes talking through about the math problem and see how they handled it and if they got it and what questions they had, etc. And they had the good fortune of being in the middle of a rigorous evaluation when they had to pivot from providing teacher tips to parent tips, and those kids learned. They reduced their innumeracy scores, and it was pretty impressive. So parents can be quite effective if engaged in the right way.
That makes a lot of sense, although I suppose we should avoid talking about what the impacts would be on the parents and their overall levels of happiness as they're enlisted into this process.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, one of the things we've done, we're doing a very large study at Brookings on parent engagement, which is part of why I'm so clued into this. Even before COVID hit, because we feel like it's a little bit of the missing link, perhaps, in the closing the inequality gap puzzle. And parents, we know for sure, we've been doing lots of surveys, don't want to be teachers. They're not interested in being their kid's teacher. It's a little stressful. I think we're seeing a lot of the sort of positive, promising early practices emerge around parent engagement, particularly with those parents who were not engaged in education before, because they had a little bit more time, right? Because of lockdown, they were around. And so the question in our minds is, how do you make that easy for the parents going forward? And like an SMS on the weekend, a phone call on the weekend doesn't, so far at least, for the parents seem to be willing to engage in that level of time and effort.
Great to hear for the educational attainment aspect of schooling. But as you mentioned earlier, school for a lot of families is more than just school. It is a provider of time to work for parents, time to earn an income, and also food security, right, for kids who rely on school lunches to get that crucial meal at the middle of the day. How do we try to replace some of those ancillary positive effects of school when it's impossible to sustain in-person learning due to the pandemic?
That's $1 million question, because we've seen hunger spiking, we've seen global poverty rising. It's very dire out there for people who were living on the edge and didn't have much. And I mean, one thing that I have also seen is that actually schools, in some ways, have emerged as sort of central community centers. I haven't fact checked this, but from my reading, I understand that sort of the LA school district, Los Angeles here in California, home to a very wide variety of people from all sorts of backgrounds and socioeconomic diversity, et cetera, was running the biggest food bank in the region. So it's schools are now going out to places. They're also serving as sort of emergency supports for frontline workers. We've seen that happen. So in some ways, schools are it's becoming clearer and clearer the sort of child development role that they play, especially for those kids who really need extra support, need food, need mental health assistance. I worry a great deal about the kids who are living in very difficult home environments. It's not a huge percentage of kids, but it's very dangerous for kids who live in abusive environments or dangerous environments. How are we going to protect them? So people are having to get really creative.
Something I wonder a lot about is the impacts on the way kids are socialized that all of these new tools have, right? Because school, kids go, they go to learn and attain new skills, but they also go to learn how to behave in a society and what sort of the rules of the road are as they interact with other human beings. And it's really kind of a proving ground for who they're going to become as adults. How do you see that process of socialization changing as a result of these new tools, both low-tech, some of the ones you mentioned, and also some of the more high-tech remote learning tools that are being employed during the pandemic?
That's a hard one, and I'm not sure I have a concrete answer for you other than to say that one thing we will see, for better or for worse, is I think this generation of kids who are going to school amid the pandemic. And it might be a little different from the youngest ones who really, you can't do virtual learning with a kindergartner, or a preschooler. It's very hard with young kids, but, a little bit older, sort of, elementary on up, they are going to be more digitally savvy and more comfortable with a remote digital world than ever before. I think already the sort of kids in secondary school around the world were on that, on that trajectory, but this has really jump-started that. So to me, it raises a question in my mind around digital citizenship. A lot of what you just talked about around the socialization of role of schools, yes, it's around how do you work with other people and get to know them and see difference and be able to get along. But there's also a citizenship nature of public education systems, which is around identity and citizenship and what does it mean to belong to this community and what are your responsibilities and what are your rights. And we haven't had an equal conversation in almost any country that I can think of, maybe with one possible exception, around what it means to be a citizen of a digital world. And so I think that there's a lot of conversations happening, and I see many more conversations happening the start of this school year in the US, at least this September, than happened when many school districts, for example, in the US went remote, around what is cyberbullying look like? What is appropriate behavior? What does it mean to be online in a classroom? Don't wear clothes, and just because you're on video doesn't mean you can say mean things in the chat box. So all those things, I think it's really going to force, and I think that's probably good because probably kids were occupying a lot of that space without much parental oversight or educator guidance. So, how do you behave online? What does it mean?
Not to mention the level of privacy that students want to have in their lives. They're probably going to be forced to confront those kinds of questions from a very early age already, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Although I think there's some data to show that young people don't really care about data privacy, for better or for worse. Because it's just natural. They're there. It's there. Of course, everyone knows. So anyways.
My take on data privacy is that it's sort of like the old saw about politics, that even if you're not interested in it, it's interested in you inevitably.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. Undoubtedly, undoubtedly.
I want to ask you a little bit about how you see the traditional model of schooling changing as a result of this pandemic. Something I've read a little bit about is how this could force more schooling and more education to take place outside through things like playing and natural learning in sort of outside the traditional schoolroom. I was wondering if you see that becoming more of a reality across different levels of education and any other trends that might be forthcoming.
Yeah, well, in the work that you referenced at the beginning of the discussion that we've done on this idea of strategies that could help rapidly leapfrog inequality or accelerate the pace of change so we don't have that 100-year gap, and ultimately so poor kids, just like rich kids, can get the full breadth of skills they need to thrive. We have looked at this idea of diversifying people and places or a local learning ecosystem, all of which are kind of buzzwords for saying exactly what you just said, which is, kids can learn to be team players and collaborative in a classroom or on a soccer field or in front of their computers trying to, through a creative, app, trying to develop a a game together, trying to create something together, each one in front of their computers. There's different experiences that can let kids develop their skills and capabilities. And I think that what this could hopefully do is sort of accelerate this idea of schools partnering very closely with a wide range of people and places that can help come alongside what is being taught in school and allow kids to practice what they're, the knowledge and information that they're learning, to apply it in real world contexts and then bring it back in. And whether that's at home with a project that you do with a sibling or in a local park or at a community center or through some type of apprenticeship, there's a whole bunch of different possibilities. But I do think that is actually a way to strengthen education post COVID and to try to close the inequality gap, because what has happened amid COVID is there's been a catalyzation of actors who are outside the school building to try to support kids' education. And it would be a mistake, I think, to, after, knock on wood, sooner rather than later, COVID is over, say, well, let's just go back to normal. Let's go back to pre-COVID times. Much of the things that we're doing right now, we want to get rid of. We want kids to actually go to school physically, but there's some things we would want to keep. And I think that ability to curate learning experiences in and outside the classroom in a nice cohesive way for kids will only sort of strengthen what public schools can be able to do.
Are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with, Rebecca, before we wrap up?
I guess my final thought is for us all to try to see what could we possibly take away that could be good. It is a really difficult time for many, many kids and parents and families and countries around the globe. I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but if there's something positive to come out of it, I hope we grasp it and we take it and we sustain some of the new creative ways that, say, parents are being engaged or siblings or technology is being deployed, so we can strengthen kids' ability to learn and grow in the future.
A great thought to end on. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Rebecca Winthrop is Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow us on Twitter. My handle is @Elliot Waldman. That's 2 L's, 1 T. Peter is @Peter Dury, Peterdoerrie. And if you dig what you hear on Trendlines, go ahead and sign up for WPR's free daily newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date with all of our news and analysis on global affairs, and you'll also get a code for a 25% discount off an annual subscription. To sign up, go to wpr.pub/trendlines. That's wpr.pub/trendlines. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.